Hello and welcome to this seminar hosted by the Deakin Science and Society Network and Melbourne STS Lab. My name's Timothy Neal. I'm a DECRA Senior Research Fellow in the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University and convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network, and with Dr. Tao Fan, co-convener of the Melbourne STS Lab. I'd like to begin this session first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you from this particular part of Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners, Indigenous traditional custodians of all the places that you are listening from today. For those who have not come to one of these seminars already, a quick rundown on the structure for today's event, which is called Reactions and Ruptures, Ethnographies of Nuclear Life. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers who are going to give 10 to 15-minute presentations on their research, and then we'll move to some discussion with our respondent, Dr. Catherine Trundle, and then questions and answers, a bit of discussion after that. So I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom, and my colleague Karina Traits will be moderating the YouTube live chat where all of you are watching. We're keen to hear and answer your questions, so you can either post questions there on the YouTube chat. You can send them to us on Twitter. We're at SSN Deakin, or you can email them to us if you really want, ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. Okay, so without much more further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our three speakers and our discussant today. Our first speaker, Dr. Kirsty Howie, is co-director of the Environment Centre of the Northern Territory and a research associate at Deakin University, where she's conducting research on the environmental regulation of onshore gas extraction, or fracking, in Northern Australia. Her PhD thesis explored the nexus between Indigenous land rights, environmental governance and development in Northern Australia, including in relation to the Ranger uranium mine. Tomoki Burkett is a gender flux Nikkei scholar living in occupied Lenape land, or New York City, who traces imperial formations that produced the conditions for the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster and its ongoing unfolding. Their work draws on Japanese anarchist analyses of empire, women's literature, anti-nuclear poetry, reportage on irradiated labor in Japan, and histories of labor migration and settler colonialism to sketch these genealogies and their reinventions post-2011. Tomoki's scholarship includes decolonial feminist analyses of Japanese empire, queer geography, reproductive labor, critical race theory, disability justice, and anti-imperialism. They are an anthropology PhD candidate at Columbia University. Dr. Maxime Polleri, our third speaker, is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at University Laval. He is an anthropologist of science and technology. He studies the governance of disasters and public health crises. His current research projects focus on the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic, and global epidemic alerting systems. Dr. Polleri is a network affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, where he was previously a MacArthur Nuclear Security pre- and postdoctoral fellow. He's also a member of the EPI AI project, Canadian-UK Artificial Intelligence Grant Initiative, that studies digital disease surveillance, as well as a member of Mitiate Lab, a international research program on Fukushima issues. Our discussant, our fourth speaker, is Dr. Catherine Trundle, senior lecturer in the School of Social and Cultural Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka. Her research sits at the intersections of an anthropology of ethics, medical anthropology, and experiments in ethnography. She examines the social life of ethical claims in a range of arenas, I should say, especially in the legal, political, archival, medical, and media-based spheres of the cultural world. Ethnographically, her research has engaged with New Zealand and British nuclear test veteran groups who seek state recognition, increased healthcare entitlements, and compensation for ill health that they attribute to radiation exposure. So 3 great speakers and a fantastic discussant. I hope you are all as excited as I am for the presentations ahead. As I mentioned, everyone's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll go to some discussion and Q&A. So be sure to be logging your questions on YouTube, and we will get to them. So with that said, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Kirsty Howie.
Thank you so much, Tim, and hello to everyone wherever you are. I hope you're all safe. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from unceded Larrakia country in Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia, where I've lived and worked since 2005, first as a settler lawyer and then as a settler researcher. I also want to acknowledge the Mirarr Gundjeihmi people, whose country I will speak about today. For them, more so than any traditional Aboriginal owners in the Northern Territory, land rights came with a terrible cost. So I'm going to speak today about Ranger Uranium Mine, which is located on the lands of the Mirarr Gundjeihmi in World Heritage listed Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory. And it closed in January this year after 40 years of operations. Its mining life for its local radioactive toxicities will live on for many generations on Mirarr country, was characterised by regular eruptions of political controversy. From its authorisation in the late 70s, to the over 200 environmental incidents reported during its life, to its supply of uranium to Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant, to its close association with the Mirarr's successful opposition to a second uranium mine on their country, Jabiluka. Reflecting on the theme, I'm going to take you to the biggest controversy, or rupture, in the history of Ranger, its approval back in 1978. While its origins were undoubtedly spectacular, I want to reflect on some undercover, mundane, bureaucratic practices that coagulated during this time and how they've structured Indigenous state extractive relations in Australia ever since. This apparently benign space-time assemblage of textual, material and social practices, which I've called a chronotope, is in some ways more insidious and toxic than the controversies we typically associate with the mine. I came to Ranger Uranium Mine accidentally through my PhD fieldwork in what's called the Section 19 team of the Northern Land Council in Darwin, an Aboriginal land council responsible for negotiating agreements for others to access Aboriginal-owned land across its vast region, essentially the top half of the Northern Territory. And I've worked in the Northern Land Council for over 10 years as a lawyer, and I guess to some extent, my PhD was concerned with understanding the power relations that I myself had produced while undertaking that work. So Section 19 refers to the provision in what's known as the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, which gives the Northern Land Council the power to negotiate to grant property interests in Aboriginal land, usually leases. And the work of the branch that I was studying, although it's enormous in volume, doesn't really attract much attention outside the NLC. It involves processing a never-ending backlog of applications for really routine land uses, things like cattle grazing, operating a community store, or constructing public housing. And the endpoint is a legal agreement or contract. Perhaps the most mundane example is the humble gravel pit agreement. So gravel's needed in the Northern Territory for the endless task of maintaining our remote road network, which links Aboriginal communities with larger centres. Despite the clear need for gravel agreements aren't particularly prized within the NLC. They're seen to be of minimal financial benefit compared with the costs of their administration and are processed as quickly as possible using boilerplate agreement templates, producing a backlog that never shrinks. Why am I talking about gravel? I'll get onto that in a second. So as I got out of the lift to do my fieldwork early on in my PhD, I encountered 83 boxes stacked outside the lift. It was an occupational health and safety nightmare. They were just brimming with documents, and I asked to review them and was given permission. And these boxes together comprised a collection known inside the Northern Land Council as the Ranger Library, and it was an internal archive of documents containing a record of the most controversial set of negotiations ever completed by the Northern Land Council. So the rocket stake in these negotiations is known as the Ranger deposit, consisting of uranium ore to be dug up on Mirarr country, ground to a fine powder on site, and then treated with acid to separate the uranium from the surrounding rock and create a powder called yellow cake. Yellow cake from Ranger would prop up Australia's faltering economy through its export to countries such as Japan for its nuclear power industry. But yellow cake was also an intermediate product in the development of a more sinister industry, the production of nuclear weaponry. It was perhaps the most controversial of rocks, and it happened to be located under other visually stunning geological formations, coveted by humans for conservation in Australia's first ever national park, Kakadu. And the land where both the mine and the national park were to be located was also to be handed back to Aboriginal people under Australia's first ever land rights legislation. So the Northern Land Council, the site of my ethnographic research, where these boxes were housed, had the job of sorting these irreconcilable things out somehow. So as I poured through the yellowing 40-year-old documents, I was really gripped by the textual revelation of an institution which was forged in a crucible of intense disputation that hasn't really ever been seen since. So there were more than 122 media stories written or broadcast about the Ranger negotiations in a very small window of time that I chose to focus on. The 2.5-month period between the initialing of the first agreement authorising the Ranger uranium mine and its eventual execution in November 1978. Breathless accounts were published by those close to or involved in the action, including lawyers sacked or cut off by the Northern Land Council. Galarrwuy Yunupingu, the chairman of the NLC, was anointed Australian of the Year in early 1979 for his efforts in securing the Ranger Agreement, giving some hint of the importance of these events in the national psyche. Those acquainted with more recent development controversies in Australia will nonetheless, and further afield, will be struck by a sense of familiarity with public discourse about Ranger. Controversies about whether traditional owners have been consulted properly in the face of unyielding government and industry pressure, whether environmentalists are using traditional owners as pawns to pursue their own agendas, and whether Aboriginal people can in fact have agency amid this conflagration. The Ranger negotiations were foundational to this enduring set of discursive relations. So in terms of their importance, controversy and scale, there couldn't be a greater gulf between the spectacular Ranger mining agreement and the mundane agreements I was observing being produced in the course of my ethnographic fieldwork, such as the Humble Gravel Pit Agreement. Yet as I reviewed the Ranger documents in parallel with my ethnographic observations of the mechanics of gravel agreements, I was struck by the sameness of the institutional actions that coalesced around both phenomena, components of a configuration that has remained startlingly consistent over time. So the configuration starts with an application to use Aboriginal land, exploit it for some purpose, and ends with a contract with a number of steps in between, which I won't bore you with today, given the time constraints. The configuration is applied across materially dissimilar subject matter. So you substitute gravel for shale gas, iron ore, or uranium ore, or move to much more ostensibly apolitical land uses. Swap gravel for a flat piece of land in a community for public housing, a police station, or an office for a corporation. It's been reproduced with increasing frequency, and over 40 years, and this is what I observed during my fieldwork, nearly all the work of the NLC has crystallised around it. Despite numerous attempts to innovate and do something different, it seems to have dragged everything in. Today, I just want to draw attention to particular aspects of this configuration that I identified, and in particular, their space-time dimensions, because agreements happen in particular institutional places at very specific times. Socio-legal scholar Mariana Valverde suggests that we turn to literary theorist Bakhtin's typology of the chronotope, quite literally space-time or time-space, to understand how the temporal and the spatial dimensions of life and governance affect each other. Bakhtin used the concept to describe the interconnectedness of representations of time and space in literature, which show how, and this is the famous quote, time as it were thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. So chronotopes are mobile and reappear across genres to advance specific narratives, shaping meaning. And extending this beyond literary studies, chronotropic analysis is a way of revealing how taken for granted time-space arrangements are embedded within particular sociocultural practices. So we can see this agreement configuration as a chronotope that first clotted during the Ranger negotiations, and it's since been reproduced to authorise development projects on Aboriginal land across Australia, assuming hegemonic force that spilled outside the NLC to shape the way in which agreement making with Aboriginal groups is enacted in other institutional contexts. And I want to just foreground two key temporal characteristics of this chronotope. So the first one is the urgent temporality of development authorisation that conditions how, when, and where agreements are produced. The agreement-making process has specific space-time dimensions, bookended at one end by an application to use Aboriginal land and at the other by the execution of an agreement, with particular tasks stepped through on the way in particular institutional places. There's no time to think about what happens after an agreement is executed, to ensure that rehabilitation occurs, that in the case of a gravel agreement, the road's resurfaced, that the gravel itself is fit for purpose. There's always a backlog to contend with, always accusations of delay by governments and developers. And this is certainly corroborated by other research that shows that native title agreement implementation, monitoring enforcement is always found wanting. They become ghost contracts upon execution. This temporal aperture of agreement making should be recognisable to those familiar with capitalist modes of development and the laws that facilitate them. It's the temporality of project authorisation. It's before a project commences that tenure is required and this componentry springs into action. And there are other legal processes, themselves chronotopic forms, attaching to this moment. Environmental impact assessments and approvals, finance approvals, loan documentation, and government sectoral approvals. This is the hegemony of agreement making and development, that it directs all resources to a mere scintilla of time, while other timescales are black boxed, not least of which is the toxic contamination of Ranger uranium mine over many, many thousands of years into the future. In addition to the immediate temporality of project authorisation, the chronotope's also temporally prospective. The practices that knitted together during the Ranger negotiations had a future orientation. It structured future operations on the Ranger site itself, embroiling the papers in unceasing paper fare, as the Mirag and Jake have attempted to hold both the state and the company to account for its 1978 commitments. But its prospective temporality also ricocheted to other agreements. The Ranger project had afterlives beyond its own localised radioactive toxicities. Once they were worked out, these practices gained precedential weight and have been recursively deployed over 4 decades, so that a gravel pit indeed resembles a uranium mine. Together, the various social, textual and material practices that produce the Ranger Agreement would establish a venerable lineage that will constrain future institutional action and reproduce the spatial application of the Ranger chronotope across multiple locations in the Northern Territory and beyond. So just to conclude, the space-time practices of agreement making give Aboriginal organisations such as the Northern Land Council an indispensable role in the machinery of development. But while certain practices are elevated and the power dynamics embedded in them, other perspectives and configurations are marginalised. And that's something I considered in another part of my research, but which I don't have time to go into today. So in the Northern Territory, and this is more relevant to Tim and my current research, opposition by some Aboriginal groups to the recent lifting of the moratorium on hydraulic fracturing or fracking is routinely countered by an assertion that traditional owners have consented via agreements often negotiated many years prior when the wide-ranging environmental impacts were not known. Once the agreements are executed, the time for dissent passes and the parties are locked in time to whatever was negotiated then. The opportunities for groups such as the Mirror to express credible views outside or contrary to the muzzling institutional space-times of agreement making are few. So just to conclude, it's the insidious and hidden world of this chronotope that is the range of uranium mines legacy, as well as the controversies about it that have erupted over the last 40 years. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That was our first speaker, and we'll go now to our second speaker, Tomoki Burkett.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that beautiful talk, Kirsty. I'm just gonna go straight into it. It's August 2018, and Ishikawa Chiharu and I are sitting down for tea. We're in Iwaki, a city only in name, made out of industrial development projects by the harbors and former coal mining towns being overwritten by a post-1970s Hawaiian-themed tourist resort and post-2011 fields of solar panels. For a long time, Iwaki was the closest inhabitable city to TEPCO's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and both mandatory evacuees and nuclear workers came in waves. Chiharu is a lifelong resident here, a woman much like what Audre Lorde calls a dyke, a powerful woman-oriented woman. We're talking about something Datsuhibaku or anti-irradiation women often thought about, how to support youth living more liberated lives under these conditions. More specifically, we were reflecting on a recent workshop I had organized for youth in the Datsuhibaku community who often experienced isolation from their peers and difficulties because of the pressures their parents and especially their mothers were dealing with. For Chiharu, these conditions meant quite a few things. First, the enduring presence of what she called danson johi, or male domination, the enraging, absurd, and wearisome reality of fighting with men on multiple fronts, at home, at schools, at local government negotiations, and at negotiations with nuclear authorities. Second, it meant the equally palpable presence of radioactive fallout, which had transformed central sources of healing for her into images of a fascist present in which both children and plants would joyfully take radiation into themselves, unaware of what that meant for their bodies. Third, it also meant what she named as a societal context in which everyone is raised to have a low, quote, rights consciousness or kendi ishiki, a society that, in her words, will not teach you that you have the right to live the way you want to, where, again in her words, self-expression is considered shameful. And finally, it meant complicity with discrimination or sabetsu created by fear and resignation. She said, the reality is that most people say, if I have to face it, I would rather leave things as they are. It's too yakkai, too much trouble once you face it. I want to take you through some of the ways that I understand the significance of how Datsuhibaku women face what is yakkai, how they face what causes trouble, which I see as a Japanese organic feminist articulation aligned with, say, Donna Haraway's invocation of staying with the trouble, or Audre Lorde's call to reach out for each other without, what she says, looking away, without avoiding each other's gaze. I understand the many kinds of work that Datsuhibaku women, and particularly mothers, undertake as analytical work that thinks critically about fascism, about the political economy of irradiation, and about what it means to practice freedom in the face of all of that. As such, Chiharu's words here should be read, I think, in the way that Grace Hong reads the work of the diasporic Afro-Caribbean poet, Audre Lorde. Hong reads essays Hong reads Lord's essays and poetry for how it analyzes the way neoliberalism increasingly relies on making, in Lord's words, surplus people in order to produce value. And she also reads Lord's politics of difference and feeling as a praxis that reshapes the necropolitical operations of neoliberal capitalism and epistemology. Her politics is a politics of laboring against death. This should be understood through Black feminist theorizations of fungibility, such as those by Saidiya Hartman, Tiffany Lethabo King, and Jennifer Morgan, amongst others. Reading alongside Hong and Lord, I see Chiharu's devotion to kaiho, or liberation or release, for herself and others as a critical anti-fascist and potentially anti-imperialist politics in alignment with queerness. First, about Danson Johi, or the elevation of men and the subjection of women as lowly and despicable beings, Iyashi or Hiretsu, which is the way that it's written. Scholarship by the feminist sociologist Aya Kimura and the queer theorist Shimizu Akiko has already demonstrated that mothers who took action to protect their children from radiation exposure in the Fukushima nuclear disaster were disciplined by the misogyny underpinning risk communication and, quote, harmful rumor or fuhyo higai discourses used in Reconstruction policies. Very briefly, Reconstruction from the nuclear disaster has been organized around the goal of having zero evacuees, of having repatriation to former evacuation zones, and categorizes statements as scientific or unscientific based on whether or not they agree with assertions by scientists connected to the nuclear industry. State and media discourses framed women who took issue with these policies as, quote, historical monster parents, who were not only irrational, ignorant, and excessively maternal, but also cast as the central cause of discrimination experienced by their own children. If we read their contributions together with those of philosopher Yuki Miyamoto and with Chiharu, we begin to see that the nuclear state being reproduced through Reconstruction is gendered. Speaking on the gendered politics of anti-irradiation organizing, Chiharu said, first of all, we have to start from getting on good terms with the pops, the osan, in charge of the relevant department at City Hall. And if we don't, we can't make it into negotiations. It's like the universe of Settai. Chiharu had been heavily involved in negotiations over the radiation levels of produce used in school lunches and in getting schools to post signs for children, telling them to stay out of known hotspots on school grounds. It took 5 years of negotiations, of patiently producing data, designing signage, ordering mock-up samples, writing to City Hall officials, school principals, and the Board of Education, before schools agreed that they would put up these signs indicating radiation hotspots, but only at the principal's discretion. In our conversation, she was speaking to the amount of emotional labor being extracted from anti-irradiation mothers through risk communication discourses that cast them as dangerously maternal and emotional. In this context, to even get to a negotiation, women first had to emotionally service male bureaucrats. She cast this as akin to settai, which refers to the common corporate practice of conducting business by providing feminized entertainment and service. Business thus takes place through women's production of male enjoyment and comfort, and here anti-irradiation women, as she's saying, are placed in a similar position. This kind of gendering of negotiations with the state is further complicated by a eugenicist logic of reproduction that operates at the level of families. As Yuki Miyamoto argues, the irradiated or the hibakusha woman is unrepresentable in the nationalist logic of reproduction. Instead, there's a fixation on reconstituting the health of irradiated men through access to unirradiated women. Marriage discrimination against hibakusha women in particular, which is something that's been documented in this nuclear disaster as well, is made possible by this very gendered appropriation. She writes, discrimination against hibakusha women persists since the male body and their overall health can be restored by non-hibakusha women. We see this logic operating in Reconstruction discourse that ignores the health impacts of radiation exposure while blaming women who are in fact hibakusha for supposedly causing the discrimination against the irradiated. Through this logic, anxiety over the reproduction of quote unquote healthy patrilineages allows patriarchs and in-laws to dismiss irradiated women as potential contaminants, unfit for their family lineage. As a result, the fact of irradiation for women is doubly erased. First, they are unable to appear as hibakusha women because of the political economy of Reconstruction, which operates as though radiation exposure levels that the nuclear authorities deem negligible is not taking place at all, that people are exposed to radiation and yet they do not become hibakusha. This is the case, despite documentation of reproductive issues associated with radiation exposure, such as increased rates of miscarriage and stillbirths. Instead of being overtly cast as hibakusha, they are called upon to do the labor of unirradiated women, to care for men and patrilineages in the wake of a national radioactive crisis. However, this work of caring for men and their patrilineages requires a substantial expenditure of effort and self-suppression that further entrenches the dynamic of feminized service for patriarchy. Furthermore, now it comes to include endlessly proliferating, often covert labors. As Slater, Morioka, and Danzuka put it, women start to attend to the quote micropolitics of radiation, when to open or shut windows, which room it was safest for their child to sleep in, frequently vacuuming away radioactive dust, secretly substituting rice from uncontaminated prefectures for the rice made by one's in-laws, measuring radiation levels, telling their children to close their mouths when the wind blows, avoiding gutters and other likely hotspots, and so on. One mother, Eriko, described her experience of the nuclear present as living narrowly, semaku kurashiteiru. This was true in a literal sense. As someone who evacuated from central Fukushima, which had high radiation levels but was nevertheless deemed safe by the government, she was what I call an unrecognized evacuee and what the state calls a voluntary evacuee. She had a mortgage on her house back in central Fukushima, but only qualified for a monthly 60,000 yen or about 600 USD subsidy. Meager as it was, she didn't even apply for that because she had evacuated with her husband and she felt that there were others who had more need for it. Instead, they chose to live with her husband in his one-person apartment. Her husband and children slept in one bedroom, one daughter in a bunk bed and the other by her father, while Eriko slept in the kitchen. They lived like this for 6 years until a coworker offered to rent them his natal home for cheap. Living narrowly was also true in the sense of making oneself small, of not allowing her strong opinions against radiation exposure to take up space. Concerned that her daughters might experience more social ostracism at school than they already did for being newcomers, doing, supposedly weird things like wearing masks to school and refusing to drink school milk because it might be contaminated, she told them to brush off any questions by saying that they had allergies. In anti-radiation spaces, women shared these experiences and did what one doctor called the work of worrying together, ishoni nayamu sagyo. This meant feeling their way through what was the best decision for their children or themselves. Many anti-radiation women supported each other through their children becoming traumatized from Reconstruction policies, through divorcing husbands, through negotiations with hostile teachers, and so on. In these ways, they cultivated spaces that went against the logic of reproduction inherent to Reconstruction, which cast their bodies as resources to be appropriated for national and patrilineal health. While doing these labors covertly was exhausting, who would claim the position of hibakusha, knowing that to do so means to claim the position of contaminated blood, of aberration, of monstrosity, and also of hysteria? To claim a position in which they have less value as women than unirradiated women. In a sense, to become a monster parent means to insist that one is being exposed to radiation and thus marks oneself out and marks out one's children to be the target of fear and loathing, to use Audre Lorde's analytic, which is directed at those who are rendered surplus. It also meant to cut ties with an aspect of a violent system that used to feel like a kind of refuge, or used to feel normal. This is partly what Chiharu is referring to when she talks about fear and resignation. She said, discrimination is what is blocking us. We're so unable to say, this is what I think, or talk about what we feel. So much so that sometimes I want to ask, what are you so afraid of? That fear is something that's there inside the family. If you go out into society, then it's even harder to speak out. And finally, I wanted to end with a few brief notes on koktai, what I call koktai, and a final note on this idea of hentai that I've been thinking about. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that Chiharu saw a low rights consciousness and that a sense that self-expression is shameful as issues that were kind of silencing people in the nuclear disaster. She names this problem in the language of liberalism as a problem of rights and a problem of shame. And here, you know, she's maybe in some ways mobilizing the Orientalist idea spread by Ruth Benedict that Japan is a collectivist shame culture lacking in the supposed democratic values of American settler empire. Instead, though, I think this should be read as an analysis of the use of shame in fascist formations across the globe. So we should think in terms of, in a fascist formation, which particular bodies are supposed to be ashamed and why. And I think that this can also be analyzed in combination with Japanese Marxist analysis of the emperor system or tennose, and then koktai or national body, which is kind of the ordering logic of Japanese fascism in the 1930s. Finally, I want to end by suggesting that there's a potential queer rupture in Japanese social life that is created by the problem that radiation exposure poses for anti-irradiation maternalist feminists. During a conversation with Chiharu, she said, I want children in Datsuhibaku spaces to meet adults who live freely. I think it would be nice if there was a space, even a tiny one, that shows them that they don't have to hold everything in. That's why in Fukushima Prefecture, where there's been little action in spite of everything, the people who did something are really a little hentai. The nuance of hentai here is abnormal or pathological, but hentai also marks the position of the queer. It was a category created by imperial Japanese sexologists and heavily associated with female perversion and crime. Critically, for many, but not all women, it was the state that had precipitated this crisis in gendered identity. When the nuclear disaster struck, in many ways, they had to choose between the safety of the family and the dangers of undoing it, even if they themselves were unwilling participants in such a gendered struggle. In the position marked by the state as hysterical, excessive, and even monstrous, anti-irradiation women continue the work of, in Chiharu's words, ichichi annoyingly taking issue with every little part of Reconstruction. This labor is mundane and wearisome, but also represents their deep sense of responsibility for their children, their hopes that their children can live freer lives, and that sometimes latent hope for a future in which women are more fully able to determine the conditions of their lives. As such, I think their struggles for reproductive justice should be understood as a critical site of struggle against koktai and the fascist logic of sacrifice it incites. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomoki. That was fascinating. And now we go to our third speaker, Maxime Polleri.
All right, so Iitate village, which is located in the region of Fukushima, is really typical of rural Japanese hamlets. You're going to find large arable lands that are located in the buttress of really majestic mountains that are going to dazzle you with their emerald green colors. And in this way, Iitate really fits with this postcard image that many tourists have of rural Japan, but with just one little detail, which is over 1.5 million vinyl bags that are filled with radioactive tainted salts. So rows of big black plastic bags piled on tops of each other, forming word-like Mayan pyramids as far as the eye can see. And most of these bags are the results of radioactive decontamination that was launched by the Japanese state after what is now known as the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So prior to this catastrophe, Fukushima prefecture was a very obscure region of northeastern Japan. But on March 11, 2011, the name Fukushima became part of history, finding its place along the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island of this world. And the first time that I set foot in this village, Iitate, was during the spring of 2016, which is more than 5 years after the disaster. And while a lot of people had initially evacuated, the forced evacuation of those citizens had been, in fact, really short-lived, because the Japanese state had adopted a policy of repatriation to irradiated areas like Iitate. And some of the very first citizens that had willingly returned were usually elderly farmers, for whom the city of Iitate was their native land, which is a concept that the Japanese calls furusato. And this was the experience of Takahashi, which was a 67 years old farmer who had returned to Iitate to grow flowers. And, as he explained to me one day, this is the place where I was born. I've always wanted to come back to this place even after the disaster, to see the sunrise, to see the moon at night, to see the blueness of the sky of Iitate. And after 3/11, the Japanese state often justified the need for repatriation to Fukushima by citing the psychological suffering that some of the inhabitants were facing because they were separated from their native lands. And one could very much see that, for instance, Mr. Takahashi was indeed very happy to be back to his native land. But as opposed to Mr. Takahashi, my initial experience in Fukushima was very different. After all, Iitate was not my native land. While the place really had its charm, I did not have the same affective attachments that farmers had with their land. And to be honest, my stay in Iitate was also punctuated by the fear of adverse health effects from radiation. And in that line of thought, a really important part of my ethnography was molded through my own corporeal and affective ruptures with radioactive hazards. And I remember a very precise event that helped me become more attuned to my positionality as an ethnographer. So in the spring of 2016, I was invited to witness the work of an organization in Fukushima, mostly farmers that had attempted to revitalize the region. And I was a little bit reluctant to accept their invitation, knowing that the radiation levels were still very high in this region. But, tempted by what anthropologists call the opportunity of good ethnographic data, I ended up going there. And at 5:30 in the morning, on a very quiet Sunday morning, I was shaken out of bed by someone named Masayuki, who needed help for some renovation at their center. So we went over there and we began to move some old planks, which resulted in propelling a very fine mist of wood particles in the air. And this sight really got me worried. I began to wonder, is this radioactive? What if I breathe those particles? Is it going to be harmful? And, I began to feel a little bit edgy and disturbed, becoming a captive of the world of radiation. And there was a similar accident that happened when Masayuki began to fill his gourd with water from a natural source. And he said to me, if you're thirsty, you can go and bring the water. It's very clean. And I was taken a little bit aback by this solicitation. Many things were jostling in my mind. For instance, should I interpret the word that he used, which was kiri, as meaning, fresh, pure, or as meaning that they had actually tested it. So I took a very small bit of it and I began to, feel anxious, really wondering, what if. But for his part, Masayuki was really gulping down large quantity of water without any apparent worries. So these kinds of experiences were really ruptures for me. And they made me realize that you cannot constantly live in a state of chronic anxiety about radiation. And it was precisely these kinds of what-if moment, the kind of impossibility of solidifying a clearer state of risk that I find very draining about living in Fukushima from my perspective. And in that regard, I noticed that many citizens that have come back almost never talk about radiation. For instance, Masayuki and I, we never discuss about health, only about the nature of itate, about the name of its plants, and so on. And after a few days there, I myself really stopped thinking about radiation because it got me exhausted. And I began to understand why many people, for instance, no longer wore masks in these contaminated areas. And this was before pre-COVID, so now we're all pretty much used to wearing masks. But the first time I put this for a whole day, it was very uncomfortable. The noise of radiation monitoring device, which always do beep, 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 also got stuck also began to get on my nerve. And I end up dreaming about this noise at night. So after my field work, when I came back to Canada in the United States to finish my PhD dissertation, a lot of people asked me if I was scared of my health. And, obviously, I was a little bit scared, but at the same time, I realized that fear was very much a luxury. So fear was a luxury that not everybody can afford. And these kinds of experience made me ponder a lot about the ethics of doing ethnography and about the huge difference between being there as an ethnographer and living there as a resident. So, for instance, I was generally funded by a lot of scholarship, and I could afford, for instance, to throw my rain boots after having walked on contaminated mud. But many of my informants couldn't do the same. So thinking about radiation hazards as a young white male and as an academic was really not the same as a farmer for whom the land was a very sacred treasure handed down from generation to generation. So in that spirit, I've tried to be very much careful of the partiality and bias that result from the investment of an anthropological practice in studying other epistemological practices, because the ethnographer always play specific roles, especially as an expert who produce so-called first-hand account about the lives of others. But in doing so, we also embed people in unexpected power relationships. So the rupture that I experienced really helped me to go beyond a little bit what scholar Abdul Lugad called the romance of resistance. So this romance of resistance that really epitomized a lot of ethnographies of disaster, public health crisis, and also environmental catastrophe. And often in these kinds of studies, there's very much the tendency to contrast the struggles of victims against the normative viewpoints of the states or the scientists or the corporate polluters. And that's an approach that often portrays people as victims. And it's been very popular in anthropology because it's a discipline that often roots for the poor and for the oppressed. And there's definitely a lot of problem with this theoretical obsession for resistance. I think that first, once again, sitting from a Hagu Lugab, describing people as victims does not necessarily give them credit for resisting in a variety of creative ways the power that control their life. Secondly, the romance of resistance also creates a hierarchy of knowledge form where the experience of victims is always described as being more right than official disaster explanations. And it's very true that corporate polluters and government often produce very simplistic claims of risk that don't echo the experience of people. But at the same time, I think it remains important, as scholar Alan Irwin says, to be a little bit critical of intellectual trends that promote an uncritical espousal of all forms of contextual understanding as automatically better than scientific accounts, scientifics in parentheses. And this is a trend that, for instance, I've seen a lot in regard to citizen science after Fukushima, which is often perceived as providing the truth against the untrustworthy state governments. But non-state actors can also very much contribute to governance tactics that have their own shortcoming, and they can also reproduce a lot of different problems. Third, the romance of resistance also casts the state as the bad guy of these stories. And through my fieldwork, the bureaucrats and the official that I interview were always, genuinely trying to help people. And from their viewpoint, a politics of revitalization was the best way to cope with this disaster. The problem is that what can help people can also harm others. So following these kinds of shortcomings, there's a lot of ethnographies of nuclear life, or more broadly speaking, ethnographies of people living in toxic conditions that have attempted to move beyond what is often referred to as tropes of damaged biologies. For instance, after Fukushima, part of this approach can be found in the notion of urgent ethnography, which has been described by different scholars as a non-judgmental process of collection throughout the voices of victims themselves. So for instance, this is present in a book called Japan Copes with Calamity, which I highly recommend reading. And it's a form of ethnography that has been very useful to move beyond this kind of victimizations. But at the same time, I also diverge with some of the theoretical aspects of this kinds of ethnography. First, because I don't believe that there can be anything close to a non-judgmental process of ethnographic recording. We always generate orientation in conceptualizing radiation hazards, often transforming the experience of our informant for a broader purpose of intellectual generalization. And secondly, if ethnography is akin to a non-judgmental process, then this raises questions about the nature of analytical inquiries in social science. And I think that the move beyond damaged biology is very important in humanizing individual responses. And it also explains how life in these places that are contaminated makes sense for people and not for others. But at the same time, this is sometimes done at the expense of a critique from the anthropologists. So, in other words, I see in the move beyond victimization or the move beyond damaged biologies a trend that prioritizes internal cultural views of affected citizens at the detriment of an externalized analytical critique from the anthropologists. And it's very important to explain the lived experience of affected citizens. But I think it's also equally important to look at how these experiences, how these narratives are shaped by larger systems or power relationship that influence parts of people's decision, practices, and discourse. And I think that a lot of nuclear ethnographies are now shifting from an earlier emphasis on victimization to moving beyond damaged biology. Once again, this is very good because it brings a deeper sense of place, which has been extremely lacking in the nuclear-related security studies. But at the same time, this is a move that should not be done at the expense of a critique or in the pretense of simply bringing the voice of people to the forefront. Because if we do that, ethnography is no different than journalism. I think it's also the task of nuclear ethnographies to critically examine the external forces that affect one agencies or discourse. What people say or do is not only the result of their free will. Different narrative, different practices are always molded by displays of power that go far beyond what some people can control. I also, to end this speech, find it very worrisome that this move beyond damaged biology is being very much co-opted by the nuclear lobby, for instance, that have their own vested interests in talking, in promoting narrative to go beyond victimization. So in a nutshell, to end this, moving beyond tropes of victimhood is very great, but it should not go at the expense of critically analyzing the practices that create harms, that create inequalities and crises in nuclear-related issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxime. And our fourth speaker is our discussant, who is here somewhere, Dr. Catherine Trundle.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for your amazing papers. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently a guest, as well as the tangata whenua of Te Whanganui Atara or Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I live. It was a real pleasure to be asked to offer some thoughts on these three brilliant papers, and I'll get straight in, starting with Kirsty's paper, which I think raises some incredibly important themes of space and time, which weave through the other two papers and indeed always weave through nuclear issues because of the ways in which the attrition of time, illness and effect are always ongoing. But this paper brims with the different layers of historical, geological and bureaucratic sediments and their exposures, from pits of gravel that end up washed away on roads to boxes stacked haphazardly about that Kirsty had to shift through, to the subterranean layers of rock that contain uranium and get dug up and turned into yellow cake, and the backlog of NLC applications in need of processing within very specific windows of time in which bureaucratic and legal proceduralism meets what Kirsty shows as the kind of capitalist and developmental urgency of time. And what was so wonderful about this paper is it shows that together these sediments create a kind of recursive institutional set of grooves out of which further practices emerge, a kind of lineage of institutional action that allow uranium mines to echo into gravel pits. And I thought that was something really seen in work within nuclear mining, is to show the kind of wide-ranging institutional effects that they have beyond nuclear escapes. And Kirsty makes the powerful point that legal contracts of native land and title and land rights agreements designed to ensure Indigenous rights also have their own kind of lineage of future making, but futures that are unforeseeable at the time, both in terms of the types of extractive technologies that will become possible in the future and the types of environmental effects that they will produce. And she cautions us from seeing the sort of dangerous spectre of radioactivity within nuclear afterlives as the primary figure of its potency. And I think this is an incredibly powerful contribution of the paper, for it's as much a kind of mundane pathways and bureaucratic protocols that a uranium mine carves out, often through the benevolent language of contract, which then go on to shape and limit the opportunities for Indigenous communities to negotiate with the state. And this is actually an act of nuclear politics that I hadn't considered, especially because I have looked at state attempts to hide and delay the release of information on radioactive harm. But what this paper shows so well is the ability of nuclear politics to focus actually our vision on the kind of visceral spectres of biological harm, and that was also mentioned in the last paper by Maxime. And this can in fact come at the expense of seeing the kind of slow violence of paper fare. And I think this offers not just a challenge to my own work, but to the broader work of nuclear scholarship, and asking, behind the fear of radioactive sickness and biological risks that's been our focus, our participants' focus often too, what else is being transformed by nuclear afterlives, particularly in terms of state and legal process and sort of the identities. And perhaps there are very, very different effective registers that we need to get used to recognizing in nuclear escapes, that are not sort of suffused with notions of hope and fear, but rather perhaps with ideas of bureaucratic efficacy or inefficacy or fidelity or innovation to process. And, they're concerned with types of the social agents that are made or unmade through law and policies we're not used to seeing. So what we can see here are sort of scales of time and space that move well beyond some of the very broad scales of time and space we're used to seeing. And you know, what was so interesting here was the way in which this paper showed the links to the Fukushima disaster through the sort of supply of the sort of bureaucratic background of yellow cake that preceded that disaster. And it's perhaps this is sort of the work of anthropology that it really, I think, is quite exciting, and that it maybe helps make explicit these social links across time and space, the chains of causation upon which new social action could indeed be based. So I think there's a lot of really productive ways to think through this paper. Tomoki's paper, I enjoyed their paper enormously. I thought it was incredibly vivid, the images of mothers and children in this sort of figures in this reproductive politics. I read an earlier version of the paper that and it was beautiful to see how it developed, and some of the things that weren't said I also really enjoyed, and maybe I'll give you a chance to speak to them from the earlier version. But I thought the way in which you know, the sort of fight for mothers' freedoms to reproduce in the ways that they wished, and the state's desire to reproduce a future for itself, and the sort of clash of these was extraordinarily vivid. And I was quite struck by the way in which mothers attempted to claim children, decisions over their children's bodies, their health, their experiences of risk, more firmly than others' claims, patriline's schools, the state, reconstruction agendas. And it became very clear the sort of deeply uneven landscapes of nuclear risk burdens. And I think maybe this wasn't mentioned in what you read out, but this movable figure of dose exposure rates, which could be set far higher than industry standards at schools, because it was, in a sense, socially and politically useful rather than scientifically advisable. And this sort of logic of sacrifice that sort of echoes back into and relies upon both sort of wartime and post-wartime Japanese figures of sacrifice was beautifully drawn out. And I think this is an incredibly important way of thinking about nuclear ruptures and the figures of sacrifice, fungibility and death in the name of the nation, which, you know, has actually always been implicitly at the heart of nuclear technoscience from its inception, these notions of fungibility and sacrifice. But what I really liked about this paper was the specificity with which you detailed those permutations of that fungibility and sacrifice. You know, and this is where I think if fine-grained ethnographic research allows us to kind of move beyond some of these sort of broader stereotypes of sacrifice into some of the ways in which these are sort of manifest through very, very sort of rich historical trajectories. And I loved the way in which you outlined the unsettling trade-offs that women and mothers were expected to bear between economic recovery and biological safety. And I think we can see in so many other examples through history with women's movements, these uneasy trade-offs that women, through their maternal identities, are expected to bear and contend with on a very personalized level, in the way in which that maternal concern gets sort of socially weaponized against them to discredit their voice and power in society. And I, you know, I just really appreciated you reminding us and thinking about nuclear technologies of the way in which the body sort of sits at the heart of political modes of domination and the narrow modes of gendered performance that lie at the hearts of fascism and imperialism. You know, this very narrow way in which gender always has to be defined as a type of male domination, and the way in which that gets kind of configured in contrast to feminized care service. And you know, when I think you encourage us to sort of link this to this notion of male domination and feminized care services, how does this get tied into systems of pollution, both nuclear and otherwise? And I think we could find so many examples around the world ethnographically of the way in which pollution gets tied in to this particular form of imperialism. And in your earlier paper, you actually talked about dirt-bound poetics and dirty politics, which didn't get mentioned here, but I just want to shout out to that because I really found that interesting, that we can talk in the same time about the fight for kind of purity and and the sort of ruptures of pollution and queerness in the same movement. And I just found it fascinating to think about how fascist imperialism, is premised upon a kind of return, a rehabilitation, a restoration, a purification of the present through notions of the past. But, this was also paralleled with women's sort of micro decisions to purify their families' homes, their food, but there were very different notions of purity that actually worked against each other and showed to me the kind of importance, again, of being very rigorous in the way in which we kind of delineate our notions of purity and pollution. I did think of Aretziger's ideas of dirty politics and dirty protest in Ireland, Northern Ireland, sort of women political figures using their bodies and notions of bodily pollution to protest their imprisonment and English control of Northern Ireland. And, the way in which state control got affirmed as the male body and reinscribed on their bodies, that the sort of variously asserted gender and sexual difference and ethnic domination kind of came to configure around those women. And it made me think it actually is really important for us to make some more expansive links here between kind of feminist ideas within nuclear movements and other non-nuclear movements when it comes to the body pollution and imperialism, that there could be something really productive to be had in seeing where the body and pollution and imperialism get configured differently when we're outside of the nuclear realm. Because I think there is maybe this is one of the ruptures that comes out of this set of papers for me, is that, the exceptionality of nuclear life often means it's sort of sealed off from comparison. It's what Gabriel Hetch calls its refusal to stay ordinary, which sort of puts it outside of kind of different comparative lenses. And I think what would happen if we were to put these movements that Tomoki outlines alongside less spectacular, less disastrous configurations of sort of the body politic, pollution and protest, and your references to queer politics at the end sort of open up a lot of fruitful avenues to explore. So thank you for that. Maxime, this was also a really, I thought, very thought-provoking paper and a real contrast to Tomoki's, and I found the contrast incredibly useful. And I appreciated the push to think about how narratives of victimhood have played within this nuclear scapes that this field has focused upon, and what a post-victimhood approach might look like. And Maxine cautions us from elevating romance, the sort of romantic resistance narratives, or the sort of uncritical elevation of research participants' voices through urgent ethnography at the expense of wider critical appraisals of the tensions, motivations, and forces at play. And I think the question that is usefully raised here is victimhood and resistance always the right hinge around which to pass possible kind of understandings of what's going on? Is it victimhood that our participants are avoiding, for example, or put another way, is it agency that they seek? And of course, just as much can be said as a critique of the way we've dealt with agency, or is it something else? And I kept coming back to that figure of the man drinking the potentially contaminated water, assuring Maxime and himself that it was safe. And, when we sort of seek to think broader than the sort of victimhood or its avoidance, we can see a whole range of other potential kind of understandings of what's going on there. Is it avoiding cognitive dissonance between what might be prudent and what might be practical? Is it a type of cruel optimism in which one leans into the source of one's possible wounding, which is always an analytic move that kind of sidesteps the figure of the victim altogether? So I think the questions that are raised here are also parallel to a kind of question of methods and representation, which is, about the ethnographer holding the power to gather life experiences as data, to decode them, to represent them textually. And, this does raise some very thorny issues about, how much agency in that position of power, of ethnographic power, how much agency do we give? And how might that be a kind of bad faith on our part to deal with our own power and to make us feel easier about it? And it raises some really interesting questions in my mind about, kind of devising modes of collaborative research in which we don't control the narrative, and what would happen in these types of field sites if we were to, in a sense, you know, do sort of a form of research in which, you know, we didn't kind of have to wrestle in quite the same way with our agency, and therefore a sort of interpretation and representation of victimhood may look different. But I was so struck by the difference in the older male farmers returning to irradiated regions and younger mothers and their young children seeking to leave. Now that just struck me as such an extraordinary contrast. And I think there's so much going on here about differences in gender and the importance of elevating that as a kind of an important mode of analytic understanding. But at the same time, I was really curious about the question posed around age and how age plays into this, not just age as a kind of sociological category that contains a set of differentiated sort of generational norms, but instead as a figure in which kind of biology and life course and notions of life itself kind of meet and diverge. Because, you know, one thing we know about radiation risk is that it's very different to a small body, it's very different to young cells, and it's very different to a pre-reproductive person compared, for example, to an elderly man. And we know at a biological level that, you know, for example, many types of cancers replicate far more slowly in the elderly because of the slow rate of their cell division. Mutations accumulate more slowly in old age. We know that low dose radiation accumulates and takes a long time to have effects. Even if one intakes a radioisotope immediately upon contamination, it will take often years for that isotope lodged in a lung or a liver to deliver enough radiation to the surrounding cells to cause mutations that are dangerous. So, you know, again, I think kind of returning to the kind of the materiality of radiation here and its effects over time reveals to us a very different level of risk for a 67-year-old compared to a 15-year-old. And I think the papers drew out beautifully a range of other factors that affect risk and kind of desires for return or sort of leaving. So I think, you know, one of the questions that's really important to ask is how might the kind of iterative timescapes of exposure cross paths with the sort of passage of time and notions of risk in ways that generate very different senses of, you know, what radioactive dust looks, feels, and seems like, or what contaminated drinking water tastes like, or what resettled land feels like. And I think those are, you know, returning to Kirsty's paper from the, you know, the importance of time here ran through all of these papers, and I think quite really actually very interesting ways. And I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on the other links they see between the papers. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So we've got roughly about 17 minutes exactly for some responses and chat and Q&A. If you're watching online, don't be afraid to pop a question in the chat and we will attempt to get to it, but I'm sure we also have lots of questions in the room. So I thought I'd give all the speakers a chance to respond to Catherine's fantastic comments there, and we might go in the order of the speakers. Kirsty, do you have anything you wanted to quickly respond to?
I do. I'll try to be quick, but I just want to say to Tomoki and Maxim, thank you so much. It's just been a privilege to be on this panel with you and to learn about your research. And Catherine, thank you so much for an incredibly generous and considered reading of my paper. It's a bit overwhelming actually to have, so I've never done this before, in a good way, I should say, but it's just lovely to have someone really, I guess, entangling themselves with your work. I just wanted to just quickly kind of, in trying to draw a link with the other papers, focus on a comment or a reflection that you'd made, Catherine. You said that my paper showed that the scales of time and space were different from the way that we commonly conceive of the very broad time and space scales in a lot of nuclear ethnographies, for want of a better term. And that is, I guess, what I was aiming to contribute to the scholarship, was showing a different way of thinking about space-time configurations and what the legacies are of these particular configurations produced at the intersection of land rights, development, and extractivism. But I guess I also just wanted to reflect on how that little world became accessible to me and my own privilege, and what was eliminated, I guess, in my reading in the paper, because in many ways, my ability to see that chronotope so obviously was a product of my role as a settler lawyer within the institution at the NLC for a number of years previously. And I was sort of filled with glee when I saw these documents, because they just seemed so amazing to me. But I actually realised that they reflected my own privilege in the institution quite quickly, as a white lawyer who had replicated, like, the documents were very familiar to me because I'd drafted them myself on numerous occasions. And when I looked at the documents more closely in light of my ethnography with people actually working in the organisation, most of the people in the organisation are not white, and they're not settlers. They're Indigenous people who live, you know, in Darwin in the Northern Territory and have worked at the Northern Land Council often for many, many decades, but they're absent from the documents. So these archival processes reproduced my own power and privilege within the organisation. And I guess I just wanted to make visible quickly, I guess, some of the people who I spoke with and spent a lot of time with during my ethnography. Many of them were Indigenous women working in the organisation who did all of the scaffolding work in the bellows, I think, to use a term that Donna Haraway has used, scaffolding the work of people like me, of the CEOs, of the people who are putting their names in these documents that will be there for people to read 40 years later. But they're made spectral by these archival practices that I myself reproduced. And I won't go into too much detail about it, but I guess I just wanted to briefly open up the possibility of a rival account of agreement making that doesn't involve my own power being reproduced recursively forever. So thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, I also wanted to thank Maxime and Kirsty for your work. It's been really wonderful to be able to hear both of your presentations and also like some of your response to Catherine's comments. And likewise, Catherine, it took a lot of internal struggle to write this presentation. So I was really happy to hear that that it was contributing to other people's thought about nuclearity in some way. Very quickly, I think maybe 3 points. Like one, the first about, let's see, maybe I'll do the dirty poetics first. So the dirty poetics concept, which is, I'm back translating from Japanese, but I came up with the term, it's jibeta na shigaku. And it literally means jibeta. I'm very particular on that word because there's a whole dimension that I couldn't really get into in this presentation, but it's there's a whole kind of a dimension of organic, what I would consider like organic in the sense of Gramsci's like organic intellectual, you know, just kind of like from just people living their lives, but organic feminist idioms of talking about patriarchy. It's always kind of in terms of women being very close to the ground and kind of being there in the dirt and everything, and men as being kind of elevated, which comes partly out of like a kind of a spatial analysis of like Japanese very kind of 19th century and earlier like architecture and the configurations of space and domestic space. Yeah. So there's that part, but then the other part that about the concept of jibeta na shigaku, or dirty poetics, that or which I also thought about translating as sticky poetics, because beta means kind of stuck to the ground. So I thought it was very speaks to kind of, you know, what it's like to really be doing all of the maintenance work and the manual labor of housework and everything, but it's also actually something that connects Japanese feminist analyses with class analyses that I was trying to work through in my work on Japanese nuclear subcontractors. And so it's actually a way to, I'm very interested in kind of like, since the Fukushima nuclear disaster, people who are there just keep saying over and over, like, the government has divided us. There's this word bundang that's become very powerful or very palpable. So I'm very interested in finding analytics that can connect across different experiences of radiation exposure while still not collapsing those differences. And the idea of kind of stuck to the ground is also a way that people that kind of lump in proletarian people like talk about themselves as like, we are the people who crawl on the ground, we're like worms on the ground. So, and then there's also a way that this kind of evokes the kind of nuclear subcontractors' worries and anxieties about whether they've been contaminated or not inside Fukushima Daiichi. So when they're working, one of my friends was a subcontractor there, and basically you're totally self-contained, and as a result you sweat profusely, and sometimes if the sweat splashes against your face, it causes this moment of total disorientation and terror, because you don't know if it's radioactive water that has gotten inside or if it's coming from you. And then there's also a way that when sweat dries, it leaves behind that kind of sticky residue, and it's very possible that radiation kind of sticks to you in the same way. So you have to go through, like, if you've been in a workplace accident or just, routine procedure, you have to go through the hand-foot monitor that checks to see if there's any particles that have been stuck to you or not. So anyways, that poetics is just something I'm kind of working on, trying to speak to, like, the very, kind of lumpen proletarian, like outside of the, the kind of classic kind of Marxist, like proletarian kind of idea of revolution. And all of this really comes from like reading Black feminist scholarship, especially Saidiya Hartman, who really talks about that because of their critique about how racial capitalism works and how we have to think kind of outside and beyond the category of labor, but not getting rid of it, but kind of thinking with alongside other forms of the production of value. Sorry, that was very long. Sorry, the other points very quickly, getting outside of kind of this idea of victimhood and stuff. I didn't talk about this as much, but I think there's kind of an analysis of that goes with Du Bois's point about the wages of whiteness that can be applied in the Japanese context as well, because Japan is still an empire. It's still colonizing Ainu, Mosir, and the Ryukyu Islands. Zainichi Korean colonial diasporic people are still being kind of subject to, I guess, genocidal policies. So there's a way that the position of the Japanese is constructed still in the post-World War II era as superior to and separate from the colonized. And there's literally you can see this through the way that colonial Koreans were kind of deported en masse from Japan and then made into illegal residents. So Setsu Shigematsu has an article on this that I thought was really helpful for anyone who's interested. I also, yeah. And then the last point, I think maybe one thing that helps me to get outside of the kind of victim duality that we talked about is kind of queer scholarship of environmental toxicity, especially the work of Vanessa Eggert-Jones, where and also Michelle Murphy. I think they're both really trying to look at how do we be responsible to and like present to the very real harms that are happening, but also not in a way that's kind of reinscribing the obviousness of like, you know, this enlightenment idea, or the kind of, you know, Sylvia Wynter says the colonial epistemology of the human, you know, idea about what it means to be a normal body, which is, you know, already kind of a total myth. I guess very briefly, like in speaking in terms of my own experiences, you know, being trans in a radioactive space, you feel a certain kind of kinship with the radiation for sure, as a presence that is like, is there, everyone, some people see it, some people don't, but that's constantly being disavowed. So that's kind of one way that I think about queerness, and maybe a way to relate to thinking about pollution, you know, outside of just radiation. Sorry, that was very long, but thank you so much for your comments.
Well, just in the interest of time, I'll go very quickly. And, you know, like Tomoki, I very agree. I think Michelle Murphy is the scholar who has best understood this kind of conundrum between damage biology and also, you know, trying to explain the broader factors that might still produce harm. Was sitting here in my paper, but didn't have the time to talk about it a lot. And just a very small comment about you know, time and age. For instance, when I interview a lot of, you know, older men, all of them were, you know, very straightforward, saying, you know, I'm probably gonna die before feeling any kind of effects of radiation whatsoever. But this still created tremendous problem because they wanted to see their grandchildren, for instance, and mothers usually didn't really want this to happen. So this created a lot of other problem. And, you know, just really quickly, I was struck also by the difference in the description that me and Tomoki were saying. But at the same time, I think her theoretical contribution is still very much the same, to try to examine those kind of broader pattern that can, you know, shape ways of thinking. And you talk, for instance, about the Anson Joey, you know, the respect for the male and the contempt for the female. And there's a kind of, you know, similar thing for the older male, which was basically explained through the political economy of nuclear power, in that Fukushima was always, before the disaster, a very poor and depopulated regions. And this is why the government put nuclear power plants in it, to, you know, try to revitalize their economy, to try to give them jobs. So as much as they consider this their native land, there's also this whole past history that has forced them to say, you know, this is their native land finally. But it was based very much on, you know, power plays and relationship by nuclear lobbies that, you know, have imposed this form of energy on the population that needed money, that was facing the populations. So I'm gonna stop there in the interest of time. And thank you so much to all of you. And Catherine, again, for reading her 3 papers. That's a lot of commitment regarding times. That is always very, very much appreciated.
Hi everyone, this is Taff Man, one of the co-hosts of the Melbourne STS Lab. We've just lost Tim in what I assume to be some kind of connection crisis. But I will just say, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us and for offering all those thoughts. I mean, I really wish we had an extra hour to work through all those issues. I would love to hear more about the period politics in particular from Tomoki, and the sort of the comments that you put forward, Catherine, in particular on age as a figure, and those specific sort of materialities that you pointed to, and how sort of nuclear effects sort of rupture through different bodies, and the asymmetries that this causes in sort of time and place, and time and place within bodies. Well, we're right on 11:30, so I think we will have to leave it there, unfortunately. But I just wanted to say thank you to each of our speakers, to Kirsty Howie, to Timoki Paquette, to Maxime Polleri, and to Catherine Trundle, and to also say thank you to Karina Traits, who's been working behind the scenes to make this happen, and to thank all of our audience on YouTube, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.